Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in just another minute as everyone is just getting admitted to the program.
Hello, Marty.
All right, Kara, so I have lost Eric on my screen. Why is that?
He's still there. You just can't see him. He should still be there. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bubby or Grandma, Language and Change in Jewish Greater Detroit. As you can see on your screen, we have a few upcoming events that we will hope you will visit our website to register for. Please visit mishjewishhistory.org/calendar to register. And if you are enjoying tonight's program, as well as all of the others that we've been having over the last year, please feel free to visit mishjewishhistory.org/donate to support our Zoom programming. And please visit emish.edu/Jewish-studies/support to support the EMU Center for Jewish Studies. As usual, if you could all remain on mute for the remainder of the presentation, we would really appreciate it. And if you have any questions that come out throughout the night, please submit them via the chat feature on your screen. We will take all questions at the end of the program, and I will serve as moderator of the chat. And all you have to do is submit your questions. And now I am going to hand the program over to Martin Schickman, our JHSM board member, to give tonight's official introduction.
Good evening. My name is Marty Schickman. I'm director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan University. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture, Bubby or Grandma, Language and Change in Jewish Greater Detroit. Before the lecture commences, I'd like to tell you a bit about EMU Center for Jewish Studies. The CJS offers classes in Jewish life and culture to EMU students, both on campus and on the road, in places as close as New York City and as far away as Germany, Poland, Spain, and Israel. We sponsor faculty and student research, including our remarkable linguistics project, Jewish Life and Language in Southeast Michigan, which you will be hearing from tonight. And we are responsible for a lecture series, which over the years has brought students and community members together to sample latkes for Hanukkah, taste kosher soul food, dance to klezmer, laugh at old Jews telling jokes, and sing with Israeli singer-songwriters. Our next event, which will be celebrating Women's History Month, is on Sunday, March 7th at 3:00 p.m., when we will welcome Israeli-Palestinian musician Mira Awad for a concert conversation. This event is free and open to the public, so please mark your calendars and look us up on the Eastern Michigan University Center for Jewish Studies website or on Facebook. We could not have put this evening's lecture together without the assistance of our friends at the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan, and I am truly grateful for their assistance. Eastern Michigan University's Jewish Life and Language of Southeast Michigan brings together faculty and brilliant graduate students, and it has already garnered international attention. Its directors are Eric Acton, Associate Professor of Linguistics at EMU. He holds a PhD in linguistics from Stanford. His teaching and research focus on the nature of meaning and how language use and interpretation vary according to context. And Veronica Grondona, Professor of Linguistics at EMU. She holds a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. Her teaching and research focus on endangered and minority languages, language planning and policy, multilingualism, and language change. I am delighted to introduce my colleagues, Eric Acton and Veronica Grondona.
Thank you, Marty. And I'm just going to get my slides up here. So just bear with me for one moment. Okay. Now, hopefully people can see some slides now. Are they showing up for people? Give me a thumbs up if you can see slides. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. All right, well, thank you again for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We're really glad you can be here with us. I hope everybody's had a good President's Day and is excited to get into some linguistics this evening. Before we start, we have some other people to thank, a couple of whom have been mentioned earlier by Marty and others. We want to acknowledge the many contributions of our student researchers whose names are listed here. They've done a fantastic job in supporting this project and driving our analyses, and we wouldn't be here without them. We too want to thank the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan University, and of course the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan for hosting this event tonight. And most of all, we'd like to thank our participants who have partaken in this study and provided just an incredible wealth of information, stories, and shared their time so generously with us. They are the backbone of this project. Okay, so before we begin with digging into our own details, I thought I would tell a little cautionary tale. So one of the key themes tonight for us is going to be that language and the social world are inextricably linked, and that one's language can have very important social consequences. Sometimes this is actually a matter of life and death. So some of you are probably familiar with this story from the book of Judges, where the Ephraimites had invaded Gilead and attempted to return across the Jordan River after defeat. And the Gileadites blocked their passage. They said, "You're not going back." And knowing of their different dialect, they tested each suspected Ephraimite on their pronunciation of the Hebrew letter Shin. So here we are from the King James English translation of this book. It says, "They said unto him," each individual, "Say now Shibboleth." And he said, "Sibboleth," for he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him and slew him at the passages of Jordan, and there fell at that time of the Ephraimites 42,000. So dialects matter. It can be a matter of life and death. In other words, our moral here is, if you're going to invade Gilead, you had better make sure you have your sheen together. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of our project very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Veronica to talk more about that. So Jewish Life and Language in Southeast Michigan, or JLLSM, is an ongoing project looking at life and language, as the name suggests, among Jewish people in Southeast Michigan. And as I mentioned earlier, the backbone of our project is interviews with individuals from the community. So far, we've collected interviews from 45 different individuals born anywhere from 1924 all the way up to 1999, so spanning 75 years. What I would like to do, just to give you a taste of what these interviews are like, is play a short clip from one of our participants. And this is a really special clip, actually, because sadly, this participant just recently passed away. And he has this wonderful set of stories that he told us and was very generous with his time. And I thought in his honor, it would be nice to play a little clip from his interview where he talks about how his father came to the United States in the early 20th century. So I'll play the clip now, and you might want to turn up your volume for some of these clips just in case, to make sure that they come through all right.
My father was born in Moscow, Russia. He was a Jewish kid at a time when the czars were not being very kind to us. And he, as an adolescent, tried to overthrow the czar. He was captured with some sensitive material, he said, and sent to a Siberian prison. At any rate, some horse thieves came through the town, and he joined and got on a horse and left with them. Worked his way across Europe to France, and in Paris he found an agency that was helping people emigrate to the United States.
So that's just one example of the special kinds of stories that we've been able to collect over the course of this project thus far. Let me turn it over to Veronica for a moment, who will talk a bit about the motivations behind this project.
So why this project? Why JLLSM? Well, there's a fair amount of research about language and its relation to social life in Jewish communities in the large coastal cities of the United States. But there's far less about Jewish communities and their languages in the Midwest, despite the large and vibrant communities that we have here. And there are many interesting questions to ask about language and about Jewish communities. Among them, some of these questions that we ask are, what does language and language use look like in local Jewish communities? How has that changed over time? And how does it compare to other local communities? Also, how does it compare to Jewish communities elsewhere? Why language? Well, language is an integral part of human life and culture. Language variation in a community tells us a lot about the community's social nature and its history. It's a window into the community's social nature and its history. Language also is something very personal. It's something that we can, that's part of our identity, of the speaker's identity. We glean a lot, not just from what people say, but also how they say it. Language gives us information about where their speakers have been, what they are like, what they value, and what they are up to.
And let's give you a couple more examples of this kind of dynamic. So here's an example of how language and history are very tightly intertwined. So you may all be familiar with the stereotype of New York speech as being R-less. So not having an R in words like fourth and floor, so that they might be rendered something more like fourth floor. Or in the case of FDR, his pronunciation of war as waw. Now, this particular pronunciation began to fade, especially at higher ends of the class spectrum after World War II. It started to dissipate. And this has to do with a couple of different social and historical changes. So for instance, one is that people from New York, as a result of the war effort, had increased interaction with non-New Yorkers. So there was more exposure to other sorts of dialects. And related to that, also the United States became more and more prestigious on the world stage, especially relative to Britain, which is another place where the dialect is quote unquote R-less. So these things together contributed to a language change in the city of New York. As yet another example, our speech as individuals can also be a way of our making a social statement. So here's an example from Michael Caine in an interview reflecting on his early career. He's talking about his native Cockney accent, which is a stigmatized variety of British English. And he says, where I came from, you never thought of being an actor because first of all, you didn't talk properly. Everyone said that to me, but I kept the accent in the hope that it would sort of break down the class barrier and say to young people like myself, you can do it. So people use their language, use their pronunciation, even to make social statements.
So language is a crucial point of connection to our experience and to each other. And we wanted to share with you something that one of our participants told us. This participant was born in the 1920s, and he told us something really interesting about Yiddish.
There are some expressions in Yiddish that capture a moment that you can't really capture it. By using the Yiddish expression, you're more expressive than you use the English expression. Some Yiddish expressions that have become common to our language because they really express the thought in a sharper, more defined way.
So what we want to show you this evening is the result of our research so far in this project. we're going to show you how the accent of local Jewish women, it seems to be shifting across generations towards something that is less distinctively local. And this shift appears to be socially motivated. In a sense, it seems to be sort of on purpose. The speakers seem to be doing this on purpose. At the same time, we're seeing that young Jewish women are retaining some traditional features of Jewish American speech, and in some cases, actually exhibiting more of these features than speakers of older generations. So maybe they're fashioning a sort of cosmopolitan Jewish identity. And let me turn this back over to Eric.
So before we go any further, just a quick overview of what remains this evening. So first, I'll talk a bit more about the project in general terms, and then our particular participants that we'll be focusing on this evening. After that, because vowels are going to play a starring role in this talk, I want to give everybody a good primer on vowels and how they work from a linguistics perspective. We'll then apply that knowledge to understanding the changes that we've observed in our community. And then we'll turn to the issue of language and Jewish identity as it plays out with the 10 participants that we're focusing on this evening. So first, a little bit more detail about the project and our speakers. We're going to focus this evening on 10 Jewish women who were born and raised in the area between 1938 and 1995. So the 5 oldest of those 10 were born between 38 and 48, and the 5 younger of those 10 were born between 69 and 1995, each group representing a couple of different generations. A little bit more demographic information. All of our speakers are college educated in this sample. In terms of denomination or affiliation, 5 identify as conservative, 4 as reform, 1 named no particular affiliation. And then in case you were interested, because Yiddish comes up a lot when talking about Jewish language, none of our participants have any real proficiency with Yiddish beyond using, some stock words and phrases, that sort of thing. In terms of geography, where these speakers are from, all of the 5 oldest of our participants were born and raised in Northwest Detroit proper. And then reflecting the sort of northwesterly migration that we've seen with the Jewish community over the latter part of the 20th century, the 5 younger speakers grew up in the suburbs, including Southfield, Farmington Hills, and West Bloomfield. Now, concerning our data, as we mentioned earlier, most of our data consist in the audio recordings of conversation, just casual conversation, questions about where people are from, their history, and that sort of thing. We also made sure to ask everybody some specific questions about their language and language use. And then one more note, and we'll come back to this later, because part of what we're interested in is pronunciation, and we wanted to do apples to apples comparisons between speakers. We did have everybody read a preset list of words to see how they pronounce them, to see what kind of variation we might observe. So for instance, does one say caramel or caramel, that sort of thing. Okay, so before we get into the details of what we found, as promised, I'm going to give you a linguist's quick guide to vowels. So what I've attempted to draw here is a nose. That's supposed to be the profile of a nose. And this would then be a representation of the inside of somebody's mouth. This being the front part of their mouth, this being the back, this the higher part near the top teeth, this being the bottom. And what you need to know is that vowel sounds, what we hear as different vowels, vowel sounds are distinguished by the shape of the mouth and especially the placement of the tongue. So for instance, let's consider the vowels in heat and hat. Now, if you were to go back and forth, and I invite you to try this at home, if you go from the vowel in heat to hat, e-ah, go ahead and try it. You will feel your jaw and your tongue drop as you go from e to a. Similarly, going from heat to hoot, oo, you may be able to feel your tongue go from a front position where your tongue is near the top front toward a high back positions, going from E to oo, E, oo, and you will most likely feel your lips round as well. It's these tongue positions and what you're doing with your lips that distinguish between vowels like E, oo, ah, and ah, and so on and so forth. Now, what's the point of this? Why am I talking about this? Well, much of what we hear as an accent or aspect of a dialect is what vowels people use in pronouncing particular words. So let me give you a couple of examples. I'm from the US and I speak a sort of lower Midwest dialect. And so when I say this word, B-A-T-H, I use a low front vowel, ah, bath. That's how I say it, bath. But many British English varieties use a vowel that's produced further back in the mouth. The tongue is retracted and low, taking you from my pronunciation, bath, to something more like bath. Bath, bath. Again, the distinction there is all about the position of the tongue. Let me give you one more example, this time within the US. So in my dialect, and you can see this little picture of me here, when I say this word, B-R-O-A-D, I say it like this, broad. Now, for many New Yorkers, this vowel is raised. That is, the position of the tongue is higher when this vowel is articulated, leading to a different vowel quality, as in the beautiful Marty Schickman's pronunciation of this word, which, and I won't do perfect justice, would be closer to broad. Broad versus broad. Broad, broad. Hopefully you can hear that difference. And again, height of the tongue is what's going on. Okay. Now, everyone has an accent. And if you don't believe me, ask somebody from the UK whether you have an accent, and they'll tell you, yes, you do. If you're from the United States, they'll tell you sound like an American. You have an American accent. So we all have an accent. And I wanted just as a quick thing, as a quick little poll, I wanted to see how many of you have been told before, hey, you have an accent. We're getting some good rates of responses here, it looks like. Take another few seconds if anybody else wants to join the poll. Okay. Maybe we could publish these results. Can you all see that? So it looks like the majority of us have been told that we have an accent at one point or another, although a number of you have not. About 4 out of 5 have. Well, I wanted to talk about this because I want to talk about the dialect that's particular to this region of the country, the United States, where we are now. And there's a shift that's taken place over time in this region, sometimes referred to as the northern cities, that has affected 5 different vowels in the region, so that they're now pronounced differently in this region by most speakers than they were, say, 80 years ago. So I'm going to focus for now on just 2 of these vowels, okay? And again, I'm going to do my best to approximate these vowels as they're spoken in the area, but let me say something quickly, which is that there is still variation within this region. So you may hear what I say and say, well, I don't talk exactly like that. And there's a good chance that you don't. But what I am giving you is a sense of what many speakers in this region do talk like, who participate in what is called the Northern Cities vowel shift. So here we go. So first I'm going to start with these 2 vowels. In my dialect, I pronounce these words as cat and lot. Cat and lot. And this is roughly how those sounds were pronounced across this region in blue here, up until kind of early mid 20th century. Over time, however, these vowels have shifted. Now let's focus first on the lot vowel. used to be pronounced lot here. Now it has been moved further forward. People pronounce it with their tongues further forward, and it sounds something more like lat. Lot versus lot. Lot, lat. In some speakers, this goes so far forward as it starts to sound more like lat. This is the same vowel in words like doctor, mom, father, and so on. I have a cute example. One of my students who's from the area told me that her cousin from California heard her saying the word solid and thought that she was saying the word salad because the ah here had been shifted forward. So, and I guess this confusion should usually not be a big deal, but I suppose if somebody said the foundation is solid, that would be much more something you would want to hear than the foundation is salad. So I guess that's about the only case I can think of where that would be an issue. In any case, let's look again at this other pair of vowels. So cat, as I pronounce it, is this low front vowel, a. For many speakers in this region, which extends from, say, Rochester all the way over to parts of Wisconsin, that vowel gets pronounced higher and fronter in the mouth. Something like cat. Cat versus cat. Cat, cat. And this affects lots of words like trap, after, back, and so on. Now, this particular vowel shift is of great interest to linguists. Slate magazine, writing up on this vowel shift, says, the Northern Cities shift may be the most important change in English pronunciation in centuries. And William Labov, one of the founders of modern sociolinguistics, says, largely because of this shift, except for the American South, regional dialects in the United States show no signs of giving way to the influence of the mass media, and they all display new and vigorous sound changes in progress. So in other words, the wisdom up until early in the 21st century was that despite what one might think, that all dialects in the United States are becoming more alike, what we were actually finding is that dialects were continuing to diverge, even in the face of mass media. And the Northern Cities shift that I was just talking about was the prime example of how language was continuing to diverge in the United States. This is where we come in, because we were very shocked to find that, in fact, in our community here in Greater Detroit, young Jewish women's speech is actually telling us that things are more complicated, that it's not the case necessarily that everybody is shifted in this manner. So let's now turn to that. Let's talk about the vowels that we observe here in detail. Here's a quick preview of our results as regards vowels. First, we find that the older speakers in our sample do in fact participate in the Northern Cities shift. That is, they pronounce their vowels as was described in linguistic research in the late 20th century, with the movement of these vowels from their original positions. However, younger speakers seem to be moving back to a pre-shifted position. Closer to that, you might find in a more general American English characteristic of the Midlands, like down here, and all across the West, extending over to California. And on top of that, the evidence suggests that this is not just some historical accident, but is in fact motivated by social considerations among our younger speakers. So how did we determine this? Well, we measured a lot of vowels, over 10,000 in fact, from our individual speakers. And then we ran statistical models to see whether the properties of those vowels, that is, the way that they sound, has some correlation to the year that the speaker was born. And indeed, we find that there is a strong correlation between the two. So going back to these vowels again, what we find is that older speakers, their lot vowel, the word in the vowel in doctor and lot and mom and so on and so forth, is further forward in the mouth, consistent with the Northern Cities shift. placed somewhere around here, and this is an approximation. So this would sound more like lat instead of lot, lat. Our younger speakers, on the other hand, have moved their lot back. When you measure their vowels, it's further back in their mouth, closer to the pronunciation before the Northern Cities shift, decades and decades ago, and closer also to contemporary vowels in a broad swath of the United States, outside of the Northern Cities region. We find this effect even more dramatically when it comes to the cat vowel. Again, our older speakers in our sample have the fronted and raised cat vowel, higher in the mouth, further forward. Our younger speakers, on the other hand, again, are back to where this vowel would have been decades ago in this region and where it currently is in very much of the United States today. And I want to play for you a couple of examples of our speakers producing these vowels so you can hear the contrast, and I think you'll be able to hear it. So here's an example of two different speakers saying the word after. Here, we just pulled the word after out of their conversation. The first speaker you'll hear was born in the early 40s, and the second speaker was born in the mid 90s. So I'm going to play these two clips one after another, and you will hear, I think, quite a difference in the pronunciation of that first vowel in that a and after. The first one might sound more like after. Here we go.
After.
I'll play that again.
After.
After. Now here's the speaker born in the 90s.
After. After.
So let me play those two again in sequence.
After.
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 Hopefully you can hear that distinction. It's very strong, after versus after. So the language is changing. So then we have to ask this question, why? Is this just some sort of historical accident, or is it in some sense motivated? Do younger speakers on some level intend to have lower and backer vowels like cat, trap, dad versus cat, trap, dad? And the answer, we think, is yes. Here's how we answer the question. Let me zoom out for a minute to language more generally away from vowels. So as you, I'm sure, are all aware, people shift their speaking styles from one setting to the next. So for instance, let's take the ing suffix, the suffix in words like doing, going, bringing, and so on. Most speakers of American English, virtually all, vary in their pronunciation from one situation to the next. Sometimes we say doing, sometimes we say doin', sometimes we say going, sometimes we say goin', and so on and so forth. Dancing, dancin', running, runnin'. Now, as you're probably aware, the latter, the runnin', doin', goin' form, is more often found in casual settings, and the former, the running, doing, going form, has prestige of some sort attached to it. We think of it as being more formal or something like that. Here's a chart. Now, the chart is blocked for the moment, but this is what you'll see in a moment is a chart of former President Barack Obama and his use of this variable. Okay, what you'll see on the y-axis is in 3 different situations, what percent of the time did he use the runnin', doin', goin' form compared to the running, doing, going form? First, there's a Father's Day barbecue that's on the White House, at the White House, where he's grilling and talking to people and so on and so forth. Then there's his speech at a press conference on the White House lawn, followed by a scripted acceptance speech that he's reading. Now, you might, in your mind, have a picture of what this trajectory would look like, and you probably think something like this, which is what we do indeed observe. When he's at the Father's Day barbecue, he's grilling and talking and joking and laughing. When he's in a scripted acceptance speech, that runnin', doin', goin' form virtually disappears. So the idea here is people generally use forms they consider to be prestigious or formal More often when they're producing careful speech, when they're paying close attention to what they're saying and they're doing it in a formal context, that will elicit the speech that they associate with prestige, all other things being equal. So the idea for us then is we want to see if our speakers shift styles. What happens with their vowels when they go from casual speech to careful speech? And we were able to test that because we had taken samples of their conversational speech, but also samples of them reading a list of words carefully. And the word list speech, that careful speech, is what we expect to elicit speech that the speaker considers to be sort of more prestigious or more proper in some sense. Let me skip ahead and show you what we actually find when we compare these things. This is a chart that now shows, based on the data that we collected and the statistical modeling that we did, what different speakers' vowels look like for the cat word, depending on two factors. One, the age of the speaker, and two, whether it's conversational speech or wordless speech. And here's what we find. Now, again, imagine that my nose is up here. So this is the front of the mouth, and this is the top of the mouth up here. The blue speakers are our older speakers. This is a hypothetical speaker born in the 1940s. For this speaker, based on the data we observed, their cat vowel is high in the mouth and far forward in the mouth, both for conversational speech, which is represented by the X, and when they're reading a word list, suggesting that there's no real distinction for them between the two. They think of this vowel not as being particularly prestigious or stigmatized. It's just what's normal. For our younger speakers, as noted before, in conversation, their cat vowel is lower and backer. But what's particularly striking is that then when they're speaking carefully and reading a list of words with this vowel in it, their vowel lowers and retracts all the way to here, suggesting that they really attach some degree of prestige or social value to a pronunciation of this vowel that's lower and backer than what has been the norm in this region for the last several decades. Why? Why is this happening? Well, as we've noted early on, language change reflects social change. Here are some potential reasons why we think this shift might be happening. For one, younger generations in our sample had greater interaction with individuals outside of the region in their formative years. 3 out of 5 of them went away either for school or for work in their late teens and early mid-20s, compared with only 1 out of 5 of the women from the earlier generations in our sample. It's also the case that the prevalence of social media was certainly greater earlier on in the lives of our younger women than those from earlier generations. That could as well have an impact. Secondly, younger generations may just have different social goals or orientations than the older generations. Perhaps greater orientation beyond the local than earlier generations. Now, it might be tempting to say something like, we think younger speakers just don't have the same affinity for Detroit or Michigan as the older speakers. And we think this is not the right way to explain things. And the reason is because our younger speakers, some of them were very effusive about how they felt about Detroit. And all of them expressed some degree of love and affinity for the area. So here's one speaker who said, you know, the Detroit suburbs and the Jewish community here is like, it's what I knew, it's what I love. And those who left were very glad to come back. So it's not to say that they're trying to distance themselves from this place because they really like it here. What we think is more likely is that younger speakers don't want to be linguistically pigeonholed, so to speak, in terms of having a regional dialect or having an accented dialect. They may have left and been told that they had an accent and didn't want to be reduced to that. Here's one of our speakers born in the late 80s. She says, do people say I have a Midwest accent? No, I think I used to have some strong A's, indicating again, is exactly those key vowels that we see shifted between the older and younger generations. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about vowels, hopefully given you everything you ever wanted to know about vowels. And it's clear that aspects of the regional accent are disappearing among younger generations in the local Jewish community. That is, younger speakers are moving away when it comes now, and let me be clear about this. These regional vowels hold across multiple different social groups, across multiple different ethnicity lines and other things. So we're talking about just at the regional level, what's characteristic of the region. Younger speakers are moving away from that in terms of their vowels. But what about aspects of language that are not so much linked to the region, but rather to Jewish identity in particular? That's what we want to talk about as the last part of our talk this evening. To give you another quick preview, younger Jewish women in this area are retaining many of the features associated with Jewishness in language, and in some cases using them more than women of earlier generations. Let's look at some examples. And now what I'm going to do is not just talk about pronunciation, but also vocabulary and even a little bit about syntax. Starting with vocabulary, we quickly think of Yiddish. Now, for a few terms, it is true that we see slightly less reported usage among our younger speakers than we do among the women from the earlier generations. And Bubby is an example of this. So while 2 out of 5 of the speakers from the earlier generations said that they used this word to refer to a grandmother, only 1 out of 5 of the speakers among the younger generations did so. Although we should also note that one of our speakers said nona, which is an example of Ladino influence. Even though this number is slightly smaller for the younger generations, we should add, I think, that some grandmothers that we talked to reported not wanting to be called Bubby. So it could be that these younger generations are not calling their grandmothers Bubby because they don't want to be called Bubby. I can recall some speakers saying, I didn't want to be Bubby. I thought of that as being a very, very old lady, and that just didn't fit with me. So that could be what's driving this particular word. What about some of these other words, though? In other cases, we actually found rates that were identical across the generations. Now, of course, with a sample size of just 10 and a discrete variable like word count, these are not going to be statistically significant differences, but we think that they're suggestive. If you take a word like kepi for head, 3 out of 5 speakers of both the older and younger generations reported using this as a word that they would use in referring to a young someone's head in talking to a young child. Here's a nice example from one of our participants who was born in the 90s, and she's a counselor at a Jewish summer camp, and she talks about an episode where there was a camper who was young and was very homesick, and she was crying, and the counselor tries to comfort her and tells her to put her kepi down while she rubs her back.
I have a funny story, not about Tushy, but I've always worked at a Jewish camp, and I had this one girl who, this was my second graders, so they were really young, and she was hysterical, crying, like, I'm so homesick, blah, blah, and I was like, put your kepi down, it's okay, I'll rub your back, and she's like, I know what that means because I'm Jewish, and it was so funny. I started laughing. Why are you laughing?
It's a very sweet story. So lots of Yiddish still being used among the younger generations. And in fact, for certain expressions, we actually find greater reported usage among the younger generations than the earlier generations. So for instance, we asked participants, what word do you use to describe a place where you would attend Jewish religious services, and how does that depend on who you're talking to, and that sort of thing. 4 out of 5 of our younger participants said that they would default to the word shul when talking about this building Whether engaged in religious life, whether talking to somebody who was engaged in Jewish religious life or not, this compared to 3 out of 5 of the speakers from our younger generation, and only 2 out of 5 of them said that they would use this word shul in talking to Jews who were not particularly engaged in religious life. For those situations, most of them said, I would say synagogue, or, in a Reform context, temple or something like that. So shul is actually potentially on the rise in the local Jewish community. And this is consistent with what the linguist Sarah Baynor calls the boomerang effect, which goes something like this. There's a ethnically distinctive cultural feature that comes in with, say, an immigrant population. And then the second generation, under pressures to assimilate, with that generation, that feature is almost completely erased. But then with third or fourth generations, those features are reclaimed as a sort of sign of cultural pride or security, so that they start to get used more again. This could be what's happening with shul, and in fact, Baynor has found in a study across the United States this same pattern with the increase of the use of word shul with younger generations than, say, with baby boomers. It could be that we're also observing a similar boomerang effect in syntax. So another area where we see some increased usage of these features is in Yiddish influenced phrasings. So we asked participants questions with pairs of sentences that were paraphrases of each other. Which would you be more likely to use, or how often would you use each? Here's an example of a pair of sentences. So one might say, are you coming to our house? Are you coming to our place for dinner? You could say, so coming to our house, something like that. Or might you say something like, are you coming to us for dinner? Which shows influence of Yiddish, that phrasing. 2 out of 5 of our younger generations said that they would sometimes use the second option, are you coming to us, compared with 1 out of 5 among the earlier generations. And then finally, to round this out, we think we might be observing a boomerang effect of sorts in pronunciation as well. So some effects of Yiddish on the pronunciation of English were heavily stigmatized for our older generations. And let's look at one particular example. And this is the NG sound, the sound that's represented orthographically as NG, being pronounced with a, quote, hard G. So the difference between, say, bringing and bringing. Now, one of our participants, who was born in the 1920s, talked about her experience growing up in a home with Eastern European immigrant parents, where in the home, they only spoke Yiddish, or almost only spoke Yiddish. When she came to school and was speaking English, her English was heavily accented by the effect of Yiddish. And one of the things that she did was pronounce these NGs with a G sound. So she says, apparently I had a hard G, bringing something to school. And she noted that this was very heavily stigmatized. She was made fun of or punished for doing this in school. So it's not surprising then that the majority of our participants don't show any sign of this particular pronunciation feature. In fact, the 7 oldest participants out of our sample of 10 don't show this at all. But 2 of our youngest 5 actually very clearly do. Let me play a couple quick examples of that. So first, here's a young woman talking about her child's education, her young child's education in a Jewish day school. And she talks about how she really values this education that the child is receiving, and how deeply the child is learning and associating with Jewish culture, Jewish language, religion, and history. And she tells the story of when the speaker tells a story of when her own best friend came to visit and was interacting with her daughter and says, sing a song for me. And she was expecting her to sing something like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Here's what she says.
She sang the Hatikva, which is the Israeli national anthem. That's what she goes around singing right now. And the song changes from like week to week. It's whatever they're working on. But she's walking around singing Hatikva. Like, that's hilarious. You know, that's hilarious. And that's how ingrained it is in them that that's what she's singing.
Now focus on how she says the word singing, and you'll hear something closer to singing.
Singing. Singing. Singing.
Here's one more example from another participant born in the 90s saying the word young with a hard consonant on the end.
Young. Young.
Young, as opposed to young.
Young.
So to summarize, we see clear retention and expansion of features associated with Jewish speech across different aspects of language, from vocabulary to syntax to pronunciation. And this is consistent with these younger participants' statements about how they value their Jewish heritage and their culture and community. So while it is the case that some signatures of regional speech, irrespective of Jewishness, are waning in our younger speakers, the speakers express their Jewishness very clearly in a number of ways, linguistically. So to conclude, as just mentioned, zooming out, our language in the local Jewish community is clearly in flux, with changes initiated by young women in particular. The vowels here are moving toward a less distinctively regional character to a more sort of supra-regional, general US type vowel space. At the same time, features associated with Jewishness are really shining through in our younger speakers, in some cases more so than in the generations that preceded them. We do have many questions yet that we're still interested in. So one of the things we're interested in is other features. For instance, T release. So I'll give you a very quick example as we wrap up. If I take a word like cat, C-A-T, I could pronounce this a number of different ways, but let's focus on that final T. So I might say cat, where I just stop what I'm saying, cat, or I could really have a burst with that T and hyperarticulate that T. So I say cat, cat versus cat. Now, other studies have associated that release of the T with Jewish speech. And we're interested to see the rates of the release of these final T's among our younger speakers. Here's an example of one of our speakers saying they love it, but instead of they love it, they love it.
They love it.
Play that one more time.
They love it.
And that has been associated at being highly represented in Jewish communities in particular instances. We're also curious about what's going on with the men in our sample. We have many interviews with men, but we want to go deeper with analyzing their speech. And we're also interested in other social groups. How does the speech of local Jewish women compare to the speech of local women of other social groups? And then, perhaps most of all, we want to better understand the orientations, values, and experiences of community members and how that relates to their language use and the change that we're observing in the community over time. Let me turn it over to Veronica to close for us.
So to conclude, there are innumerable promising paths for future research for us. Language is a window into the history and the social life of its speakers. And the better we understand language and its use, the better we can understand the social world in which it operates, and vice versa. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric and Veronica. Right now, we've already had some questions that have come through on the chat, and some comments as well. So I'll just begin with those. The first was, I grew up in Flint from 1947 to 1965. Language and use of Yiddish were more in the home, not in the community. Moving to Detroit area was a cultural shock, mostly language related. Another viewer said, is shul related to practice, especially conservative?
That's a great question. So we don't know, the sample that we just reported, I think, is too small to say among our 10 speakers whether there's a relation, but in Benor's work, she has found a relationship between involvement in Jewish religious life and the use of shul. And the more involved one is in Jewish religious life, the more likely they are to use the word shul as opposed to say something like synagogue. Now, I can't recall off the top of my head whether it depends on being conservative versus, say, reform, but I do know that sort of degree of involvement in Jewish life, regular attending of services and that sort of thing is a predictor. The more you attend, the more likely you are to say shul.
Another viewer said, I am interested in the Jewish-Gentile dichotomy here. For example, they say across, not across, bud or buddy is big, and get a coffee, not a cup of coffee.
Oh, interesting. So, wow, so that is interesting. So yeah, I don't know. Some of these are features that I haven't heard of being investigated. So I can't say for sure how robust they are, but those would be interesting to look into, those particular phrasings. I'm trying to think of another example of that. Across is one that I've noticed anecdotally, and I have never been able to tie it to a particular demographic. Another one like that would be where some people will say both, as with, some will pronounce it with a sort of L in it, so it's like both. And I'm not sure exactly what the demographic associated with those are, but those would be interesting variables to look into. So thank you for that suggestion.
I was on mute, I apologize. Another viewer said, this is interesting, but with such a small N in your study, how can you come to meaningful conclusions? Is your plan to eventually interview hundreds of people?
That's a great question. So that's an important question for sociolinguistic research in general, is sample size and sampling. On the sample size front, even though we have relatively few speakers, because we have a continuous variable in the without getting too technical, the way that the vowels are measured is with respect to measurements that are continuous. So, it's in hertz, and, you could say somebody's second formant was 2300 hertz versus 1900 hertz or whatever. And because of that, and because of the strength of the age effect with respect to these vowels, we still find statistically significant, we submitted this to significance testing, very strong statistical significance with respect to that cat vowel in terms of its placement, even with a small sample size. Now, the more speakers we analyze, the richer the picture will be, and the stronger the statements we can make about what's going on. So that's certainly the case. Regarding some of the more the vocabulary type stuff, that's a situation where we will need both to analyze more of the speakers that we already have, but also to probably expand our sample in order to really understand what's going on there, and to be able to say with confidence that this is a real effect and not just some sort of statistical accident. There was another question in there. Oh, the other thing that I think we need to think more about is, what are the properties of our sample beyond some of the demographic characteristics that we talked about here, and how might that be potentially affecting our results? And I do think that's a really deep and important question. I hope that answered the question.
How are the young speakers learning these features if the older generations do not use them?
That is such a good question. We have some true sociolinguists in the crowd this evening. So I'll say a few things about that. One, it is often, for many hypothesized reasons, it is often that young women are innovators in language change. And this happens across many, many communities. Now, what could be going on here, and this is just a hypothesis at this point, what could be going on here is, consciously or not, our younger generations of speakers are getting more exposure, whether in person, through social media, or other means of interaction, to speakers from other regions who produce different kinds of vowels. And they, in turn, are taking in and adopting some of these features themselves. I can say from anecdotally, just from my own personal experience, when I went to college, I'm from Ohio. When I went to college, my best friend was from Brooklyn. And she used to make fun of the way that I said the word movie, because she thought that ooh vowel was very far forward. She would say movie, movie. She would repeat every time I said it. So I said, what do you want me to say, movie? But I became self-conscious about that. And I think it's probably true that I've backed my vowel a little bit as a result, because I was young enough. It's also the case that young people's linguistics, their phonology is more pliable than somebody, once they get past the age of, say, 25. Most speakers are pretty set in their ways in terms of pronunciation, not completely, but largely, I would say. So that could be part of what's going on as well.
Another question that came across was, what kind of sample size do you need for a study such as this?
That's a good question too. And by the way, I don't mean to be answering all the questions, Veronica. If you want to jump in on any of these, just I've just been thinking about these things a lot lately. What sample size do we need? Well, the rule of thumb has been traditionally with vowels. The rule of thumb has been, if you want to compare vowels across groups, you want to have at least 5 speakers within each group that you're going to analyze. So let's say you were doing not just age, but you also wanted to do ethnicity. So you would want to have it, and let's say you were dividing your speakers into older and younger, you'd want to have 5 of ethnicity A that were young, 5 of ethnicity B that were older, and then, 5 of ethnicity A that were older, and then the same for ethnicity B, and so on. That's a rule of thumb. The more, the better. As I said earlier, we've been able to achieve statistical significance handily with some of our vowels, even with just a total of 10 speakers in this tight sample. Now, we have other speakers that we could well include in our analysis, but doing the vowel measurements in the transcription is quite time intensive. So we wanted to see what we had with a tight controlled sample first before we went further. And now we have some promising directions in which to expand our sample.
Another viewer said, my grandmother would say about a restaurant visit, I took the fish, your mother took the chicken. Have you come across this construction?
I haven't in our interviews. I don't think you have either, Veronica, if I'm not mistaken. I have not encountered this. That's an interesting example. I wonder if other people have encountered this or say this themselves. I'm seeing Marty shake his head no. Yeah, I'm not particularly familiar with that, but that's really interesting. I would be interested in knowing the history, that the grandmother, where she's from, whether some place in the United States other than here, or was from here, where her parents were from. That's a really interesting case. I'm going to jot that down. I took the fish, so instead of ordered or had or something like that.
As we make our way through the chat, I will see if there's a follow-up to that.
Thank you.
Another viewer said, I was born in 1939, male, grew up in Detroit, moved to California in 1964. I didn't take part in NCS, but in California, I found that I was pronouncing finger like singer. It took a conscious effort to change that. Clearly, I wanted to conform to what I considered the standard and found my pronunciation stigmatized. I am a professor of psycholinguistics.
Very cool. Yeah, I have another story like that, but I'll save it for if there's time for my own speech, where I didn't realize that I had a non-standard construction in my dialect until I was in my late 20s.
Is there a particular range of years in which the vowel change started to happen?
That's a really good question. It was first documented, discovered by linguists as a phenomenon, I would say in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, what's interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, for most speakers, their phonology is pretty much more or less set. I'm not saying completely. There are going to be exceptions to this. You know, if any of you move to the American South, you might pick up a little bit of that local twang, but you probably won't much if you're over 20, 25. Given that we have speakers who were born in the late 30s and early 40s who are evincing the Northern City shift, that suggests that this was already taking hold, say, in the 1950s, at least with these two vowels that we talked about tonight. And it's believed that those two vowels, I mentioned that there were 5 or 6 involved in the shift, those two were the first to go, the first to shift, and then others changed subsequently. What I would like to do next, among other things, is look back to some of our speakers who were born in the 20s and early 30s to see, are they pre-shifted? Which would be really interesting, because then what we would see is the oldest generation of speakers that we have don't have the Northern City shift. The baby boomers and the late silent generation are the first to have the shift. And then by the time you get to late generation X and early millennials, it's on its way back out again.
The same professor from earlier also commented, children learn the local dialect from peers. My children who grew up in Berkeley speak a California dialect that I do not. And of course, people whose parents speak with a foreign accent do not have that accent in their own speech.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah. And that's to that question earlier about why do the younger speakers not show the Northern City shift if the older generations do? Then the interesting question is, where did it start? So that's exactly right. So children tend to speak more like their peers than their parents in terms of their vowel space. But then what got that change started? Which of their peers were the first to start doing this, and why? Yeah, and it's not clear entirely whether for our very youngest speakers, for instance, whether this is really socially motivated for them, like, you know, I want to sound not parochial or not provincial, I want to sound like I have a more general American accent. Or if they're just that change has already taken root in their community and they're now just learning the language of their peers. It's not so much socially motivated, perhaps, for some of them.
I was able to scroll further down on the chat with the taken question earlier. Her grandmother was from Romania, but grew up in the Lower East Side of New York City until age 15. So that's.
I am going to see what I can find out about this. This is fascinating to me. Yeah.
Another viewer said that Oak Parkers who grew up in the 50s to the 70s have an extremely broad A for daddy and basketball. I wonder if Southfield or West Bloomfield say their A's as broadly. There was another comment that came through.
Good question.
Have you ever heard that?
So what I can say is that with big vowel shifts like this, they do tend to I can say, let me be more specific. The Northern City shift seems to have hit the large metropolitan areas first and then radiated outward. Now you might expect, so it goes, like I said, from about Syracuse, Rochester, all the way across to Wisconsin. You might think it just swept, say, east to west. But what we see is a model whereby it hits the big cities first, and then it spreads outward from there. So all that to say, it is quite likely that the degree of shift, and this is where a larger sample would really come in handy, that the degree of shift could be different depending on how close you are to an urban center. Now we think that maybe social class is a factor as well. that is something that we're in essence accidentally controlling for, because all of our participants in this sample are middle or upper middle class and all college educated. But I agree, digging into particular communities would also be very interesting to see what kind of variation there is. I can say anecdotally, I see less, living in Ann Arbor, I see less of the northern cities shift here than I do in communities closer to Detroit. And I wonder if that's not because of so much in and out migration from Ann Arbor because of the university here.
A couple of comments that came through. My peers age in the 50s laugh at our children in their 20s who are using more standardized vowels. We ask with amazement where they picked it up. And another viewer commented, I've heard of taking for magazines, back to the taking ones. We took the Times or we took the Post.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Another question is, where do kitty corner and catty corner come from?
I don't know. I don't know. And I grew up, what did I grow up? See, now I'm already, I've become confused. I grew up saying catty corner. And I think that there is what's sometimes called an isogloss. Here's a linguistics term for you. So an isogloss, if you look at a map, is a line across the map that distinguishes between where something is said one way and where it's said another way. And I think, but this is just me speculating. My recollection is that there is something of an isogloss between sort of central Ohio and then the northern cities region. If I'm not mistaken, and some of you can correct me, I think kitty corner is more common up here than catty corner, but I'm not sure about that. But I don't know the origin. My wife, who's from Alberta, Canada, says kitty corner, for whatever that's worth.
Another viewer had the question, my dad, who was born in Detroit, but whose parents were European born, would say, close the light instead of turn off the light. Oh. I've never heard anyone else say that. I never knew my dad's parents. Are you familiar with this expression? I have to say, growing up I have a mother from Wisconsin and a father from New York, and we actually said, close the light.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, these are great. These are great. I'm writing this stuff down. Thank you for that.
My grandmother from Poland would say, make the light, not turn on the light. It could be a literal interpretation is what one of the other viewers said. Mm-hmm. Close the light was used in Philadelphia was what another viewer answered.
These are sometimes referred to the extent that they are in essence word for word translations. These are sometimes referred to as loan translations or calques in linguistics. And you know, the expression enough already, that's a perfect example that comes out of the Jewish community of a calque where it's a word for word translation from the Yiddish to say, in essence, enough already. And that, of course, that expression has made its way across multiple ethnic lines in the United States today.
How did you decide to focus your study on this population?
I think a couple different things. One, we wanted a cross-disciplinary project, and we knew that working with Marty and having the Center for Jewish Studies, that we would have just a richer experience. The better you understand a community, the better you're going to understand what's going on linguistically. And I think that was a big driver. Also, the gap in the research. Like we said early on, there's been so much, in relative terms at least, that's been done, say, in New York, Jewish New York English, or even LA, but very little that has been done in the Midwest. And Detroit area has such a vibrant Jewish community. We felt like we need to know what's going on here. And we were curious about things like, do you see similarities between Jewish speakers in New York and Jewish speakers from around here? With respect to vowels, not a whole lot of overlap. There really is a pretty clear distinction between the two. So I think the clear gap in the literature, the interdisciplinary connection, together with the proximity of the population altogether made it really ideal.
A comment on the awareness of dialect. I speak the Southern Ukrainian Yiddish of my family, which is a marked dialect. When I'm in a Yiddish discussion group, I self-consciously shift to standard Yiddish, especially among Yiddishern regional dialects that can be scorned.
Very cool.
Another viewer commented, pop versus soda is a classic one. I live out west and I mentally remember to say soda, not pop. It's a debate in our household because I am not from Michigan, but my children are obviously born and raised here. And I say soda and I tell them that pop is what I called my grandfather.
By the way, if you want to do something fun when you hang up on this call, if you Google New York Times dialect quiz, it will take you not more than 10 or 15 minutes to complete, and it will go through a number of these things. What do you call, a carbonated sweet drink? Pop, soda, Coke. What do you call something that is across an intersection diagonally? Kitty corner, catty corner. I don't have a word for this. It runs through a handful of these. And then it'll generate at the end a heat map of the United States, of the places that are most similar to your dialect and least similar. And I've found it to be very accurate in many, many cases. So that's something fun that you might do. See how good they are at predicting where you're from on the basis of your answers to these questions.
Some more comments that came through. In Detroit, I've noticed people say really and truly rather than just really or truly. And people work at Ford's, not Ford, and shop at Myers, not Meyer. Another said, we said shut the light, but my friend raises down the window. Another viewer commented how some say aunt, as in A-N-T, where others say aunt.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm going to Hudson's versus I'm going to Hudson for the department store. Another viewer said, close the light sounds German, Pennsylvania Dutch, out in the light.
Interesting.
Another viewer commented, that's similar to, do you have what to eat?
Yes, yeah. Now, I haven't heard any of our speakers use that, but I am aware of that one.
Another viewer commented, when my mom, also Detroit born with European parents, said Halloween, I always laughed because it sounded like hallow as part of the word, like hallow or hallowed be thy name, rather than how everyone else pronounces it hollow, as in Halloween. Any idea where that came from?
I don't know. I'd have to know more about the situation. Both the speaker, the air region where the speaker grew up, but also the mother's history. But I mean, that would be a particular vowel that would participate in this northern city shift. So you might get something more like Halloween versus Halloween, depending on where you're from. Yeah.
Is the word ain't appropriate to use instead of is not?
I say yes. It depends on the context, right? So if you look back at Obama's speech, you remember that diagram where he had less and less of the inform across 3 different contexts. It just depends on the context and what you want to achieve, right? So, as a linguist, I know there are other linguists here, we're kind of not in the business of telling people how they should speak, but rather trying to document and explain how and why people actually speak the way they do. But at the same time, I think, there are rhetorical advantages to using vernacular forms in some cases and disadvantages. And we do see politicians do just that sort of thing, right? Where, for instance, they might use a vernacular form, a double negation, for instance, as a way of saying, I'm relating to you as the people, or I'm taking off my, my prestigious mask, and I'm going to get real with you for a moment, and there ain't nothing wrong with that, that sort of thing. So I think it just depends on the context.
Another viewer commented, even those who do not leave the region but move outside of the original neighborhoods, their peer encounters are much different over the generations. My parents had no Gentile friends, and our children have criticized us about the same. That must influence speech.
Yeah, great comment. One of the things that we did, and this is another one where I think a larger sample would help. We did ask our participants about the nature of their social networks. Questions like, roughly what share would you say of your friends in elementary school were Jewish? How about high school? How about today? And we did attempt to construct a sort of Jewish network score for our participants. So, if they generally answered, all the kids I went to school with and all my coworkers and all my friends are all Jewish, they would score very high on this network score. And if they were at the low end on those questions, they'd be very low. And most of our participants were somewhere in the middle. With our small sample of 10, we did not observe any strong effects of one's Jewish network score on their pronunciation of the vowels, except in the case of one that I didn't talk about earlier, which is this vowel in the word like boot. That oo vowel, we find is further forward for younger speakers, which is consistent with a shift that's happening sort of across the United States. But that is inhibited in the case of younger speakers who have very strong Jewish networks. For very strong Jewish networks, you are less likely to get this fronted oo, and you're more likely to get the backed oo. Now, for a lot of these other variables, one's Jewish network is going to make a big difference, just like participation in, say, Jewish religious life does have an impact on various aspects of one's linguistic behavior. But that's a great point, and I think we'd like to go deeper with that.
A couple final comments before we end the program. Another viewer said, I think the Myers and Hudsons, etc., are possessive. The store is not said, but understood. And another viewer said there's a new expression with young people is when they agree with you, they say really.
Oh, interesting.
So
that shows how out of touch I am, because I wasn't aware of that. That's an interesting one. Yeah. So as an affirmation, somebody says something and you say really, not as a question, but as an affirmation. That's interesting. I'm going to be listening for that in my students. The Myers thing, and I know a couple other people mentioned this as well. I believe Anne Curzon has written or spoken about this. So that might be something that you could also do a Google search of sorts, this Michigan possessive. Now, I will say it's not only found in Michigan, because I can think of many people in Ohio, where I come from, that do the same thing, but that is something that people have written about that you might look into further.
A couple more comments. The professor who has commented before said the English of my parents' generation was peppered with Yiddish words and expressions which everyone understood. It took conscious effort to suppress them when talking with non-Jews. Another viewer commented, younger people often say guises, Guises.
That's true.
And another commented, we're seeing more and more Yiddish words in crossword puzzles.
I believe that. I had one more. I won't show the chart just for logistical reasons, but Sarah Bunin Benor, whose work I mentioned earlier, she, if you're interested in Jewish English in the United States, I would say she's the premier expert, and she's written extensively about this. So she's somebody you might look up. And she did a really interesting corpus studying of in this case, I think it was articles from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And one of the things she looked at was the word shul, for instance, and how there's this huge uptick in the use of the word shul in their articles that occurs in the late 70s and early 80s, where it's just down near the bottom and then it goes up. And I will say, yeah, I definitely hear more Yiddish even than I did as a kid. And I grew up in a suburb that was pretty heavily Jewish compared to the rest of the United States. I'd say at least a quarter of my classmates were Jewish. But I do hear more now in sort of popular media.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. This was a really wonderful and lively conversation. The link to the New York Times dialect quiz, someone very kindly put into the chat. So if you want to visit that real quickly and take a look at that link, that would be great. And I can include that in my email to you all tomorrow as well, so that you have that moving forward. Eric, I don't know why I keep thinking Veronica and Eric and I combine them, so I apologize. Eric and Veronica, and also Marty, thank you very much for bringing us this really wonderful presentation with such a lively, wonderful conversation. Thank you all for Zooming in tonight, and we look forward to seeing everyone very soon at another one of our Zoom programs. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.